Welcome to our week 2 video. Today we're going to take a look at some material from chapter 4. So chapter 4 looks at demand and supply and the equilibrium in markets for goods and services. What determines demand? What determines supply? What determines the equilibrium? Why do our demand curves and supply curves shift around? And how do we know, given a scenario, whether we would be able to say that the demand curve has shifted or the supply curve has shifted. So I would say that the most important takeaway from this video is, given a particular scenario, which would be something you would see on an exam, for example, will the demand curve shift or will the supply curve shift? So the first thing we're going to look at is the supply curve. So supply defined is the relationship between price and quantity. So all we're saying here is that there is a relationship between price and quantity. So the price of certain goods will determine the quantity that is supplied by the producer. And what we have here is a supply curve. So the supply curve is based off of what is called a supply schedule. A supply schedule is just going to be a tabular representation of prices and quantities. So at a price of 30, for example, 10,000 pairs of jeans would be supplied to the market. At a price of 40 or 50, 20,000 pairs of jeans would be supplied to the market. Now, the difference between the supply schedule and the supply curve is really just that a supply schedule is a table of corresponding prices and quantities, whereas a supply curve is going to be a graphical demonstration of that relationship. And if you're noticing that this happens to be a linear relationship, you're right. The other thing is that it happens to be a positive linear relationship, and that is our law of supply. So getting all of this terminology straight is very important. What do I mean when I say supply? What do I mean when I say supply schedule? What am I talking about when I say the law of supply? When I say the law of supply, I mean that if there is an increase in price, we should see an increase in the quantity supplied. So quantity supplied then would be the particular amount supplied given a particular price. This information is also part of our demand analysis. So what is demand? I apologize, I might have some messages coming through. But what is demand? So demand is going to be looking at not the producer's perspective, but instead it's going to look at the consumer's perspective, something we might be able to relate to more easily. So the demand is a relationship between the price and the quantity demanded by the consumer for a certain good or service. So the relationship between price and quantity demanded. And I would say this is from the consumer's perspective. Next thing we might ask ourselves, and it is mirroring the above discussion, is what is the demand schedule? So to the left we have a graphical representation of demand, of the demand curve. And we see there that there is a negative correlation between price and quantity. So the law of demand means that as we raise prices, less will be demanded. And that implies a negative correlation between price and quantity. Now, I could also put this information into a tabular format. And in a table, the graph becomes the demand schedule. Just as with the law of supply and the supply schedule, it's simply a table of the prices and quantities supplied. So in our demand schedule, it would be a table of the graph for the prices and quantities demanded. Okay, so now that we've got some basics down, let's make sure we understand what is quantity demanded. So when we say demand, when I refer to demand, I'm referring to the entire demand curve. When I say quantity demanded, I'm referring to the particular quantity demanded given a price. So for example, at a price of, let's talk about iPhones, okay? At a price of $700, a particular quantity will be demanded of iPhones. And if we have a demand schedule, if we know what the industry looks like for iPhones, we can simply graph this and come up with the quantity demanded. Now, because consumers are sensitive to prices, and we're going to go further into this, not so much in macroeconomics, but when you take a microeconomics course, or if you have taken a microeconomics course, you would understand that consumers are constrained by budgets. And that means that at lower prices, consumers will demand more of a good that they prefer. Okay, so let's finish this. Okay, so at a price, a high price, the quantity demand will be that quantity that I put right there. Sorry, this is kind of getting messed up. There we go. Okay. Now, for example, if we were to decrease the price, or if for some reason the price of iPhones fell, and just given what we know about this industry and the consumer demand here, when the price of iPhones falls substantially, there is more quantity demanded. We can see that by simply sketching it out. Okay, so supply, demand, two different concepts, one from the consumer's perspective in demand and one from the supplier's perspective, but mirror images of one another. So demand is nice in isolation to look at, and so is supply, but really the meaningful analysis can be done once we actually put these two into equilibrium. So that is once we overlay demand and supply. So if we have a particular supply schedule, we can graph it out as we've done here. And if we have a particular demand schedule, we can graph it out and we can determine equilibrium. And equilibrium will be the place where transactions occur. So at equilibrium, we would have an equilibrium quantity supplied and an equilibrium price. So that would be the price that the seller receives and the price that the consumer ends up paying. And this quantity down here would be both the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. So it would be the quantity that that industry or the individual firm decides to supply to the consumers, and it would be the quantity that consumers end up buying. So we see here that the two are, that supply and demand are both in equilibrium at an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. Now, I would say that some confusion starts to come into play when we think about why the demand or supply curves for different goods and services could shift. Again, we have to apply our ceteris paribus assumption to this concept. So in ceteris paribus, what we're saying is that while one variable can change, all others remain the same. And I'm sort of going off the page here, so let me pull that back onto the page. Oops. Okay, so why does the demand curve shift? Why does the supply curve shift? Well, the demand curve shifts for several reasons, and I would say that these reasons would be very, very important to include on your notes, which you can bring into your final exam. So a shift in demand would mean that the entire curve is actually going to shift out and to the right or in and to the left. And so we would have a change in demand at every price. You can see that here. The first reason we might have a shift in our demand curve is that there could be a change in income. So if the income of the group of consumers rises, they will demand more goods and services, ceteris paribus. If they demand more goods and services, ceteris paribus, we could say that that demand curve is shifting. And in this situation, because their income is increasing, the demand curve would shift to the right, as I have illustrated. The second reason that the demand curve can shift is because the population simply changes and we see increases in certain types of goods because of demographics. So one example of this could be if we have a wave of immigrants coming from Italy, for example. So when the Italians came to the United States, they heavily demanded pastas and wonderful Italian breads. I'm very hungry. And cookies. And so the demand for items like that would have shifted to the right. So because the demographics changed, the demand changed for different goods and services, and perhaps the demand for pasta changed significantly with the changes in demographics. So population can influence demand significantly. Changes in taste can influence the demand curve. Tastes and preferences are simply something we cannot predict. From one period to the next, people demand one thing over another, then they don't want it anymore. It goes out of favor. I think a great example is those hoverboards that everybody is riding around on. I don't have one. I don't know if you do, but there's something that everybody wants. So when the demand for those items increases, we don't just see a change in quantity demand if everybody is wanting hoverboards. What we see is a shift in the demand curve completely that alters the price, the equilibrium price and quantity which would be transacted in the marketplace. Okay. Now, the fourth reason we might see a shift in the demand curve is because of changes in expectations about future conditions and prices. So the future. If we expect the prices of something to increase in the future, we're going to increase our demand now for that good or service. If we expect the prices of things to decrease in the future, we're going to actually decrease our demand for that good or service because we know it will be less expensive in the future. I always give the example of Black Friday for this. So we all know that flat screen TVs are going to cost a quarter of what they cost every other day of the year around Thanksgiving and Christmas. So what that means is if I'm in July right now and I'm anticipating Black Friday, my demand curve is actually going to shift in, and so will everyone else's. And that lowers the equilibrium price and quantity supplied and demanded in expectation of increasing our demand in the future to purchase the flat screen TV for a quarter of its normal price during Black Friday weekend. Okay, and we also need to look at related goods. So we buy things by making choices, whether we're buying goods or buying services. And if there are substitutes or complements available, we can either substitute for one good when the price of one good increases, or if the price decreases, substitute into that decreased good, that price that has or that product that has a decreased price. And it also affects how we buy things that are packaged together. So for example, substitutes would be a good that can replace another good. It's relatively similar. So for example, if the price of silk increases substantially, we might buy less silk, so the demand for silk would actually be decreasing. And we might buy something that would be similar. So perhaps polyester or rayon is similar. So if this was the price and quantity in equilibrium for polyesters, and we saw the price of silk increase substantially, we would actually increase our demand for polyesters, which would cause the price of them to rise. Complements instead relate to goods that are used together. For example, if you own a vehicle, you know that gasoline is a complement to it. You need gas to run your vehicle. And your car has tires on it. So, if the price of gasoline were to increase substantially, we know that we would buy less gasoline to run our car. And if we're buying less gasoline to run our car, we also know that the tire wear will be much less significant because we're not driving our car. So along with increased gas prices and less consumption of gas to run our car will be decreases in consumption of tires because we won't be running through them as fast. So I highly recommend you review the reasons why the demand curve shifts in depth. Know that we always start out at a particular point and then the demand curve shifts in or out. Okay, now the next thing we're going to look at is the supply curve. So the supply curve is going to look at the consumer's, or the producer's perspective as to why the supply curve could shift around. When we look at the demand curve, we're thinking about, from the consumer's perspective, why our demand curve would shift around. But now we have to kind of put on the supplier's hat and look at this situation from their perspective. So, from the producer's perspective, there are several reasons why the supply curve can shift. Again, these are very, very helpful to have for your final exam. Let's make some space here. Oops. Okay, so the first reason that the supply curve can shift is the supply curve can shift when we have changes in different natural conditions. So What do I mean by that? We can have different things, for example, in agriculture, which can drastically affect the supply of a different good or service. So actually, I'm going to make another text box for this. So the supply curve can shift due to natural conditions. For example, a drought, natural disaster, okay? If we are Florida orange growers, okay, and we have a significant drought, that won't just reduce the quantity supplied of oranges, but will also reduce the supply at every price. So that drought would represent a shift in the supply curve to the left. Droughts tend to be a really good example that you'll see in a lot of exam questions surrounding agriculture. So I would like to highlight that as you take notes for your exam. Now, another reason why the supply curve could shift would be due to input costs in the production process changing. So if input costs, a key input in production, changes significantly, this can alter the supply curve for a particular firm. For example, if we are making cookies and we're a bakery, if the price of flour and sugar and butter fall, or one of them falls significantly, that would cause us to increase our supply, because ceteris paribus, our input costs are going to be relatively lower, and therefore our profits would be higher. So this could cause a shift to the right. If the price of flour rose substantially, and that's a significant input in our production process, it would cause the supply curve to shift inward and to the left. Now, the third reason why the supply curve can shift is because of new technology. So new technology, it sort of feels like input costs, but it's different. And the idea with new technology would be that, yes, new technology would allow us to produce more at all prices and quantities, but it would also allow us to potentially reduce our costs. I always like to think of the Model T example because it's just so striking, and it revolutionized automobile ownership in the United States. Before the Model T existed and cars were not made on an assembly line, they were extremely expensive and only available to the very wealthy. With the technology of the assembly line, this allowed for Model Ts to be produced rapidly and much less expensively. And so a reduction in our costs increases the profit for the firm, and it would increase the supply. And government policies can also be influential over the supply curve. Government can either subsidize or tax private enterprise. So when they subsidize private enterprise, it causes the supply curve to shift to the right, because essentially they're reducing the cost to the firm or increasing the profits. When they tax companies, this would reduce the profits of the firm, increase their costs essentially, and by reducing the profits, it would disincentivize production, and our supply curve would shift to the left. The book does give a nice summary of the 4-step process for determining shifts in supply and demand. It asks you to think about what the demand and supply curves in the market looked like before the change occurred. And I do think it's very important to sketch your curves out. Where are we right now? Whether you have actual figures or hypothetical construct, sketch it out. Right now, we're here. Decide whether the change affected demand or supply. And a good way to do this is to look at, if you know your reasons for impacts to supply and demand, then you can adequately analyze the situation. So if somebody writes in a question, the population of, or maybe not the population, but how about people are all of a sudden really into hoverboards, and you look at the variety of options you have. Well, does this have to do with income or population or the future expectations? Does it have to do with related goods or government policy? To me, that says changes in tastes and preferences. People are demanding, they're arbitrarily demanding these hoverboards. I don't know why. So we know that that would influence the demand curve, but how would that influence the demand curve? And this is a pretty easy one. So in step 3, you decide whether the effect on demand or supply causes the curve to shift to the right or the left. We have our situation where we're at now. If people are demanding more at every price and quantity, we know that we don't just have a movement along the demand curve because the price didn't change. If the price changes, the quantity changes. Quantity supplied or demand would change. But if people are just arbitrarily loving these hoverboards, they think they're so cool, maybe celebrities made them kind of popular, I think that's one reasoning, then we would actually see the demand curve shift, and it would shift out and to the right. There we go. So I could call this like D2. Oh. Demand 2 for short, okay? Now, the last thing you want to do, and we haven't talked about this too much, is you want to compare the original equilibrium price and quantity to the new equilibrium price and quantity. So this one makes sense, right? When people are demanding something and nothing else has changed, the amount of suppliers in the market haven't changed, the cost to produce it hasn't changed, just there's more demand and we have a fixed supply. The impact we would see here in the market in the equilibrium transacted price and quantity is that we would see a higher price and a higher quantity supplied and demanded. So you can see in our original demand curve, let me denote this differently. I enjoy the color pink. Okay, on our original demand curve, we would have an equilibrium price and quantity for these hoverboards of P1 and Q1, or QS, quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. Now, however, if people just, they love them, they just can't live without them, they're riding them around everywhere and breaking bones, which is, they're kind of dangerous, you see the quantity demanded shift to the right, and subsequently, we would have a higher P, or price, and an increase in equilibrium quantity supplied and demanded. So always go through this rationale, make sure you understand why demand and supply shifts, and understand the difference between when I say there's a change in quantity supplied. Whenever I'm saying there's a change in quantity supplied, that's just implying a movement, along the supply curve. A change in quantity demand would be a movement along the demand curve, whereas anything that causes the curves to shift would actually change the whole demand. The demand has shifted out, demand has increased, or demand has decreased, okay? Whereas supply has increased or supply has decreased. Okay, terminology is very important here. Please let me know if you have any questions on this material, and please take some time to reflect upon it and then submit your discussion forum post for the week.